Humans, Humanity and Human Rights, an Amateur Speculative History. Chapter 1, Introduction to Concepts and on Early Humans. Subchapter A, Human Evolution and Human Rights. Although there are no doubt a few holdouts, I think it's fair to say that it is generally accepted that the physical form we call human evolved. We had a starting point as we morphed from earlier forms of life into what we now term human. More prosaically, we morphed from primate to human, technically through a number of Homo species to Homo sapiens. We've kept changing in some ways since then. For example, Cro-Magnons were more robust and had larger brains, I understand, than modern humans. But most spectacularly of all, and more positively, how we use our ability to think has evolved. Mostly for the better, but perhaps not always. The richness of language, the elucidation of human rights, and the development of medicine and democracy are, in my view, examples of better developments, whereas pollution, warfare, and dictatorships are examples of change for the worse. The start of human rights. The elucidation of human rights. It's a lovely phrase, rolls delightfully off the tongue, and has all the wonderful connotations that go with human rights. Fairness, caring, compassion, the best of humanity. In my experience, which encompasses some of both the worst discrimination and best human rights, respect, kindness, and support of humanity, these days many of us tend to think of human rights as something associated with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, formulated after one of, if not the, worst abuses of human rights in human history, being the Holocaust and World War II. But human rights goes back much further than that. As an illustration, across the Pacific Ocean, many US citizens would associate the term with their nation's struggles around civil rights, that is, against racism, a struggle which is ongoing and, as I write this in 2019, seemingly worsened. Their struggle against racism has also been tied up with the struggle against slavery, which has existed for millennia. And with regard to that struggle, one of the earliest acts was possibly the Mughal Emperor Ashoka's banning of slavery more than 2 millennia ago. Abolitionists since Emperor Ashoka have ever agitated, advocated, and advanced that cause, and sadly, the struggle still continues today. Often intermingled with that struggle has been the struggle for women's rights, which in the West has gone through a few phases, including the suffragettes and the earlier suffragists who won women the vote and political rights, and the broader push for equality that took off in the 1960s. The 60s, a time of the counterculture, consciousness raising, and in my case, kindergarten and primary school. And consciousness raising takes us back to the elucidation of human rights, which is still lacking for many people in the world on the basis of race, sex, sexuality, gender identity, politics, and just about any pimple of difference that small-minded and or fearful and or taught to hate people can magnify into an excuse to disparage. So, given that little exposition on the longer than often realized history of human rights, how did that elucidation of human rights start? If I take this back to the start of our humans' history, at what point did a former primate, or several former primates, start the thinking process that led to the elucidation of what we now term human rights? The elucidation or formalization of human rights was likely, in my opinion, a thinking process initially, as opposed to, for instance, jumping straight to lawmaking and or enforcement. Furthermore, some might consider it arguable whether it was a process of inventing something new, as James Watt did with the steam engine, or a description of something already existing, as Newton did with gravity and Einstein did with gravity, light, and the way we view physical reality in the sense of space-time. I consider it was the latter, as will soon become apparent. if I really want to consider the history of human rights before history, i.e. in prehistory, how can I possibly know what we humans were like back then?